Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week we go one-on-one with State Auditor Shad White. He's been a focal point in state efforts to investigate the TANF fraud scandal. But did his office and other state agencies move quickly enough to end the scheming? And what does he think about Brett Favre's claim that he's done nothing wrong? Shad White is with us this Sunday on Mississippi Insight. State and federal prosecutors have secured guilty pleas from some of the main figures in the biggest welfare fraud case in Mississippi history. But there are other players, even a former football standout, who insist that they've done nothing wrong at all. We'll explore some of the key issues in this case with State Auditor Shad White. The Republican from Flowood has held that post since 2018. Let's get right into it. Brett Favre has said that on television that I've been unjustly smeared in the media. I've done nothing wrong, and it's been a pastime to set the record straight. No one ever told me, and I did not know the funds designated for welfare recipients were going to the university or me. I tried to help my alma mater, USM, a public Mississippi State University, raise funds for wellness center. Is Brett Favre right, and has he done nothing wrong? And if not, why is the state trying to sue him?
Sure, yeah, I think that ultimate question gets decided by both a judge and prosecutors at some point. So as you know, the state is suing multiple individuals. Brett Favre is one of those individuals to try to recoup these millions of dollars of welfare funds that my team uncovered had been misspent. And so ultimately a judge is going to decide if he needs to pay the remaining money back that the suit alleges he owes. In addition to that, prosecutors get to decide if any individual, Mr. Favre or anybody else, are going to face criminal charges for any of this. Really, the way I think about my job as state auditor is I lead a team that is supposed to dig up the facts, supposed to tell taxpayers how their money was spent, and if that money was spent in violation of the law, we're supposed to write that up in an audit finding and show the public that. And of course, we work with prosecutors, give them that information, and if prosecutors decide to indict an individual, we'll arrest that individual and then participate in the trial. So the ultimate question is going to be decided in the courts, I think. I think what the public needs to know and what has come out over the last few years is that millions of dollars flowed to this volleyball court at the University of Southern Mississippi at Mr. Favre's urging, and those were welfare dollars. Those welfare dollars by law cannot be spent in the way that they were. And then on top of that, my team of course uncovered that $1.1 million flowed to Mr. Favre and Favre Enterprises. The contract that justified that payment was a contract that required him to give certain speeches and do certain things. In a meeting both with an agent from my office with the FBI present, he confirmed that he had not given those speeches. So those are really the nuts and bolts facts. The auditor's office is in charge of getting you those facts and getting those facts to prosecutors and the courts, and then we let the courts decide who ultimately is responsible.
Now, Brett Favre paid the principal amount, but not the interest. Are you confident you'll get the remaining amount from him? So
really the way this unfolded was as soon as the audit finding came out, Mr. Favre repaid $500,000 of the $1.1 million, and Favre Enterprises made a verbal commitment to repay the remaining principal in installment payments, and then they failed to do that. So fast forward about a year or so, my office issued a demand to both Mr. Favre and many other individuals saying, okay, you have to repay this money at this point. That demand that went to him was for the remaining principal, so the $600,000 plus interest, which is what we charge anybody when we identify misspent money. He then repaid the remaining principal. He still owes the interest, and the state has sued him for that reason. At the end of the day, a judge is going to get to decide if he owes that money back and really any of the misspent funds. It's going to be a huge, complex undertaking because we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. It's going to take a ton of time for the court to parse through all that, but we're here to help as a state auditor's office. We uncovered this in the first place, and we're here to provide any information we're needed to provide in order to keep that process moving forward.
And let's look at some of the texts that Favre sent in July of 2017 to Nancy New. She's the owner of the nonprofit Mississippi Community Education Center, which funneled the DHS money to USM for the volleyball stadium. He wrote, Nancy, I spoke with John Gilbert this evening, and between you and I, he is very leery of accepting such a large grant. It got me very uneasy. He also wrote, he did mention trying to find a way for John to allocate money to an entity that could then give us that would pay for brick and mortar. I passed some of the info to John, and of course, he sent back, we will find a way to make it work. Federal regulations on TANF funds specifically prohibit their use in brick and mortar construction projects. Do these texts suggest that Favre knew that this was TANF money and that he took it for the stadium anyway?
You know, I think what the texts show is that Mr. Favre was obviously aware this was government money. So he knows that he's dealing with government funds because he's texting back and forth with John Davis, who is the head of a government agency handling government funds. He obviously knows that he's arguing to send this money to a volleyball court. That text shows that he is aware that some lawyer somewhere out there had reservations about this being a brick and mortar expenditure. That language is exactly why my team, once we discovered the payment of this money, that's why we said this is not an allowable TANF expenditure, because it did go to pay for a brick and mortar structure, this volleyball court. Moreover, the volleyball court was not used for the benefit of the poor, which is what welfare money should be spent on by law and by regulation. I think beyond that text, I'd add one more to you for the audience to consider. There's the text where he says, is there any way for the media to find out how much I was paid and where it came from? I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of the text. So yes, I think that Mr. Favre is going to have to do some heavy lifting defending all of those texts. Ultimately, the real question in the auditor's office is, was the money spent in accordance with the law? And our answer, of course, is no, it was not. That's why we demanded the money back. Really, the remaining questions about how much liability he has, what prosecutors will think about those sorts of texts and his state of mind, those are all considerations that those parties are going to have to make, and we're going to provide them whatever information we have so that they can think about that.
So the money was really spent on brick and mortar, so why isn't the state going after USM for that volleyball stadium to get that $5 million back?
Yeah, it gets complicated because USM a public entity, and they would have to repay that money back to the taxpayers from taxpayer funds. So that's a consideration. I think the DHS and the lawyers at the Attorney General's office, the private attorneys that they've hired, I think that was a consideration that they made when they were thinking about who do we sue for this. Really, we leave that up to them. Those are the attorneys who are supposed to represent the interest of the state, and they get to decide, okay, well, do we think we can get this money back from this person? Does this entity owe something? And we really just provide the facts for them as they walk down that road of litigation.
So you're saying either way, the taxpayers are on the hook, whether USM gets sued to give the money back or whether they keep the money for the stadium.
That's why that situation is complicated, because USM is a public entity. I'd say this more generally too. Whenever we see money that has been misspent, the state can decide to hold the individual who allowed the money to go out the door liable, or the state can hold the recipient, the end recipient, liable. And really, there's a policy choice in there to be made about who is most culpable at the end of the day. And so in this case, you've got John Davis, the head of an agency. He's the one who signed off on some of this money flowing. And then you've got Nancy and Zach New, who are running a nonprofit, and they signed off on the money to flow too. So they can be held liable for this, which is why when we were issuing demands in my office, we were issuing requests for the money to be repaid. When it came to that volleyball money, we told John Davis and Nancy New they were the ones who had to pay it back. I think if USM were in the case, and if we had told USM, you got to pay that $5 million back, USM would likely say, well, we had a lawyer look at it. We thought that this volleyball court was at some point going to be used by Miss New to benefit the poor, and she didn't ever come and use it for the poor, so that's not our fault. I think that's probably the argument you would hear from them. So that's why a lot of the focus has been on John Davis, Nancy New, Zach New to repay that $5 million worth of volleyball money.
When recipients receive the money, is it incumbent on them to know where this money's coming from when they apply for a grant like this?
Well, I'll give you an example of why it's very difficult sometimes for recipients to know the rules around the money. One of the expenditures that we saw when we examined how TANF money had been spent was an expenditure buying an ad in the Clarion Ledger. So if you asked yourself, well, is it the Clarion Ledger's job to know that TANF money could not be spent on an ad in the Clarion Ledger? The answer is no, obviously. The Clarion Ledger doesn't have folks who are TANF experts. They probably had somebody walk in their door, say, hey, I need to buy an ad. They didn't ask questions about where the money came from. They just said, sure, that's what we do. We sell ads here and write newspaper articles, and they ran the ad. So if you went to the Clarion Ledger and you said, you're supposed to know the TANF rules, you should have known not to take that money, they would say, no, I'm not supposed to know the TANF rules. In fact, I did exactly what I was hired to do, and I'm not paying you back that money that you paid me. So really, there are some situations where the end user can very easily argue, no, I'm not supposed to know the rules, you're the one who's supposed to know the rules.
The scandal dates back to John Davis's appointment to DHS by then Governor Phil Bryant in 2016. Your office identified $94 million in suspected funding by DHS for that year on, including about $5 million for the stadium. USM did not stop the deal. IHL did not stop it. The State Attorney General's office did not stop it. Your agency did not order arrest of New, Davis, or 4 others until early 2020.
Right.
Should your office and others have acted sooner to scrutinize these funding schemes?
Well, that all happened, of course, before I was state auditor, so I was an attorney in private practice at that point. We really got our first piece of information that suggested a lot of this was going on back in the summer of 2019, and I'll brag on the investigators and auditors in the auditor's office right now. From the moment that we learned that some of this might have been happening, that team of professionals reacted incredibly quickly to put a stop to what is now the largest public fraud scheme in the history of the state of Mississippi. I mean, we got the tip in the middle of the summer, and by January, we were taking evidence over to a DA who then indicted a bunch of individuals and cut off the flow of money, again, just a few months later. So no, I reject that criticism that we could have done this faster. I don't think there's a team in the state who could have responded quicker than we did. I would also add this, of course, we've given everything that we have over to the FBI. They've had what we've had for a long, long time. It's been a couple of years since.
But you were put in an office in 2018, is that correct?
Correct, that's exactly right.
So you had 2 years before all this.
1 year. So
okay.
1 year, yeah, it would be. I was put into office in 2018, and so we got the tip in the summer of 2019. I would say this too, my team saw evidence that there weren't good safeguards in place for how we were spending welfare money before we got that tip in. And so this is just a few months before. I told DHS, you guys really need to hire an outside CPA firm to come in and examine what you're doing to make sure that you're spending TANF funds in accordance with the law. And of course, they did not do that. Fast forward just a couple of months after that, we get this tip in about a potential kickback scheme at DHS. That's what really led to all of this unraveling. And ultimately, I think the team at the auditor's office reacted incredibly quickly. We did, the investigators did an incredible job taking a very small tip about a kickback scheme or a potential kickback scheme, and then using that to uncover the fact that tens of millions of dollars of welfare funds had been misspent.
Nancy New and her son Zach both pleaded guilty to criminal charges. John Davis pleaded guilty last month to federal charges. New and Davis are now cooperating with federal investigators, but your office didn't share your findings with the U.S. Attorney's Office until they learned about the case from news reports. Why not?
I would correct that. That's actually not true. I told U.S. Attorney Mike Hurst before these individuals were arrested that this case was coming. So he made a statement to that effect, which was just absolutely not true. He knew that this was coming before the arrest. I would say this too. As soon as the arrests were made and we had a good evidence file that we could give over to the FBI, we gave the FBI everything that we have. They've got every piece of evidence that we have in our evidence locker as well. So they've had what we've had. I'm not sure why he made that statement or what the basis of it was, but the truth of the matter is the federal authorities have had over 2 years to look at the exact evidence that we have had. They have arrested no individuals beyond the individuals that we have arrested. They're now the lead agency in this investigation. We're assisting them, so we've assigned investigative assets to assist them, and we'll just see where it goes from here.
So are you continuing to work with federal investigators at this point?
Yes, correct. So not only are the agents that I have in my office who have been working on this case helping those federal investigators with whatever document analysis they may need, but we have contributed one investigator full-time who will be helping federal investigators going forward on this. So while they're the lead agency and they absolutely are investigating all of this, and I'm confident they're going to get to the bottom of it as far as it can go, we're in an assisting role now. Despite the fact that we uncovered this, we're helping them because this is such a broad, sprawling scheme, and we're eager to continue on this road and make sure that this case is thoroughly investigated at the end of the day.
Do you anticipate more arrests to come?
I think that's ultimately the call for prosecutors. So prosecutors are going to take whatever the FBI digs up, whatever we dig up, and they're going to look at it, they're going to make a decision, and I wouldn't speculate about whether or not there are more arrests. I think if you're a defense attorney out there, what you would love is for the state auditor to start speculating about what might happen next in a court of law. What I would say is we're going to work on digging up these facts. We're going to make sure that we do so hand in glove with the FBI, and then ultimately prosecutors are going to make their decisions.
Your former boss, former Governor Phil Bryant, remains at the center of this case, though he does not face any criminal charges. He's fighting a subpoena in the state civil suit for his direct communications with Favre and other defendants and other documentation on the stadium funding. Do you believe the governor greenlit the spending with full knowledge that he may have been illegal to do so?
You know, I think that a judge is going to have to make that call at the end of the day. They're going to look at all of the evidence they have in front of them, and they're going to figure out who is liable. I've made this point in the past, you know, if you're the governor, it's very easy to say to a staffer, hey, this sounds like a really good idea. We should go do that if we're allowed under the law. And if you say something like that, that doesn't mean that you're green lighting spending knowing that it's illegal. So those are the kinds of arguments that I think you're going to hear back and forth. And I think you're going to hear, you know, attorneys for John Davis and Nancy New say that, no, we were just trying to do what the governor wanted us to do. Ultimately, the judge is going to have to figure that out. The courts are going to have to figure that out. And again, we're here to provide that sort of information to them to make sure that they have everything that they need. Really, our focus, of course, is more on the criminal side at this stage, because that civil case is proceeding between individual parties and DHS, the agency that is in charge of trying to recoup some of this TANF money. So our focus is making sure that the criminal investigation and the prosecutors who are looking at that criminal investigation have all of the documents that they need over there.
Text obtained by MississippiToday.org clearly show that the former governor supported Favre stadium efforts. He also communicated with Favre about DHS findings for the drug company Pravicus. He had agreed to accept stock that in that company prior to the 2020 arrest. Is your office actively investigating whether the former governor did anything illegal in these TANF schemes?
Well, what I would say is we're in an assisting role right now with federal authorities, federal investigators, and I won't speak for them, but I would tell you that their general MO is to say anytime a big case comes into their office like this, they're going to investigate it thoroughly. And I've been told that personally by the U.S. Attorney. We're going to investigate this thoroughly. We're grateful for the help of the State Auditor's Office and the investigative resources that we have dedicated to them. And I think that they're going to touch everybody who's involved here from top to bottom, the most important person down to the least important person.
Former Governor Bryant hired you as his director and when he was Lieutenant Governor. You worked on his election campaign. Yep. He appointed you for this position now. Yep. Do you find that it could be in a conflict of interest for you to be part of this investigation?
Well, no, because the real question is, if there's a conflict, what should I do about it? Well, the answer is I should give it over to the FBI, right? And that's exactly what we've done. So I gave all that information over to the FBI in 2020. My investigators have been working with them. They're the lead agency now. And so I don't know of another way to mitigate that conflict other than giving it over to them. I guess the only other thing I could have done is just buried my head in the sand and said, nobody look at any of this stuff. I don't feel comfortable touching it. That would not be doing my job, right? I think we would be having a different interview right now where you would be saying you hid your head in the sand and you avoided looking at all this because you knew Phil Bryant. Really, the bottom line for me is that I knew that would be a criticism from the very beginning. I knew that folks would want full transparency in this case, and that's why I said, let's give everything that we have over to the FBI. They're the lead agency now, and I think it's very hard to argue that there's going to be a group of federal investigators in the Department of Justice under the Biden administration who are going to ignore key details involving Republican donors or elected officials or anything like that. This is going to be thoroughly investigated at the end of the day, period.
Do you believe the governor's going to face any charges?
Again, I think for anybody that we're talking about, I think that's the decision of the prosecutor. And I wouldn't speculate about what a prosecutor is going to do with this because that would prejudice the case from the very beginning. That's their call, and we're going to let them do it.
What do you make of all the national attention this story is getting and the focus that we're getting from the national media about what's going on with the welfare scandal?
Yeah, I think some of it, of course, is driven by the fact that you have a Hall of Fame quarterback involved, and I think that's triggered a lot of the national coverage. But I think the second layer of coverage, if you start to think about it, really is driven by the fact that Mississippi is a state with a ton of need, and we have a ton of TANF dollars at our disposal for that reason. And we have, over the course of the last 2 or 3 years under John Davis, as a state, we have misspent a ton of that money. And we in the auditor's office, after we uncovered that, I think once we put those facts out there about all the different ways that this money had been misspent, I think that hit people really hard around the country when they started to see, okay, this is a state that absolutely needed to spend this money in better ways to benefit folks who were in need, and it simply did not. My hope at the end of all this is that the national attention will result in a couple of different things. One, it will send a message to folks that they're not going to get away with schemes like this in the state of Mississippi, that if you are trying to steal public money, we are out there looking and we're going to find you regardless of who you may be. And two, aside from that deterrent, my hope is that the national media firestorm will create the situation where we make better decisions about how to spend TANF money, where we think twice about handing money over to a nonprofit, where we really dig in deep as a state, as taxpayers, and ask questions like, what is going to make the biggest difference in a person's life when they're in need, and how can we use that money, leverage that money to achieve that difference? That's my hope.
Shad White, State Auditor. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having
update.
me. Yes, sir.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Big thanks to State Auditor Shad White for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.